Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're unpacking one of the most fascinating, tense, and honestly paradoxical places on the entire planet, the Korean Demilitarized Zone. We're going to explore exactly how a simple line drawn across a peninsula morphed into an accidental, permanent fixture of global geopolitics. We're diving into the stark, rigid reality of the world's most heavily armed border.
And it all starts with a massive, looming question, right? How in the world does a temporary ceasefire last for over 70 years? Well, the reality is, a formal peace treaty was just never signed to end the conflict on the Korean Peninsula. Because of that diplomatic void, the DMZ remains this ultimate frozen frontier of the Cold War. We are literally looking at a region where a technical state of war persists today. They've been locked into tense geopolitical standstill for over 7 decades.
Okay, let's dive right into Section 1, Drawing the Frozen Frontier. To truly understand how this incredibly tense divide actually started, we've got to rewind the clock and look at the chaotic landscape at the end of the Second World War. This story unfolds in 3 major beats. First, in 1945, after Japan's defeat, the Allied victors divided Korea into occupation zones with a totally arbitrary cut at the 38th parallel. Then, jumping to 1950, after separate states had formed, North Korean forces crossed that parallel to try and unify the peninsula by force. Now, this triggered a massive UN-backed international intervention led by the United States alongside a direct Chinese military counter-intervention. Finally, after 3 years of absolutely brutal warfare that reduced the country to rubble, a stabilizing ceasefire was signed in 1953. And get this, the front lines settled almost exactly where the war had originally begun. Let's zoom in on 1945 for a second, because the granular detail of this division is just astonishing. 2 American officers were tasked with figuring out how to divide these occupation zones. And you know what they did? They literally used a National Geographic map to draw a line roughly in half at the 38th parallel. Just think about that for a second. They made this monumental, history-altering decision without consulting a single Korean. This entirely arbitrary split laid the physical and political groundwork for what would become decades of devastating conflict.
So, that brings us to the end of the fighting, but with a massive geopolitical caveat. When the Korean Armistice Agreement was signed on July 27, 1953, it was signed by the United Nations Command, the Chinese People's Volunteer Army, and the North Korean Army. Notice who's missing there? Yeah, Syngman Rhee's South Korean government flat out refused to sign it. They fundamentally objected to the existence of a divided nation. Because South Korea held out, it left the peninsula in a perpetual state of suspended animation.
Let's move on to Section 2, Anatomy of a Border. We've talked about the history, but let's shift gears and look at the actual physical mechanics of the DMZ. How does the world's most heavily armed border physically function? Well, it starts with the number 160. That represents the 160-mile length, which is about 250 kilometers, of the buffer zone. It cuts right across the entire Korean peninsula from coast to coast. But while it stretches 160 miles long, this heavily fortified buffer is also precisely 2.5 miles or 4 kilometers wide.
Now, right within that 2.5-mile width, there is an absolute center, the Military Demarcation Line, or MDL. This is the exact midpoint of the DMZ, and it is not just some imaginary boundary. It is physically marked by 1,292 painted signposts. This is the literal, physical line where heavily armed troops from both North and South Korea face one another, just staring across the divide, day in and day out.
Right in the middle of that line is a place you've likely seen on the news, the Joint Security Area, or JSA. Located at Panmunjom, this is famously known as the Truce Village. This specific location is used for diplomatic exchanges, face-to-face negotiations, and, quite frankly, very tense guard standoffs. It is the absolute only place inside the entire DMZ where personnel from both North and South Korea stand mere feet apart from one another.
But here's the thing. The tension isn't just above ground. Over the decades, South Korea made a chilling discovery. North Korea had secretly undertaken a massive underground military engineering project. Step 1, blasting through solid granite. Step 2, digging multiple, multi-kilometer military incursion tunnels directly beneath the DMZ. And Step 3 reveals the terrifying objective here. These tunnels were specifically designed to launch a massive, surprise invasion directed straight toward the South Korean capital of Seoul, which is located a mere 35 miles south of the border.
Which brings us to Section 3, Flashpoints and Close Calls.
If you haven't realized it by now, the term demilitarized zone is a massive misnomer. Over the years, this strip of land has been the site of numerous bloody clashes and high-stakes international crises. Think about January 1968. In that single month, two major crises occurred. First, you have the Blue House Raid, where a North Korean commando team secretly crossed the DMZ with the explicit mission to assassinate South Korean President Park Chung-hee. That event sparked a whole wave of low-intensity cross-border skirmishes. Then, in that very same month, the Pueblo incident happened. North Korea seized an American intelligence spy ship, the USS Pueblo, in international waters, and they held its entire crew captive for 11 agonizing months. But perhaps the most visceral flashpoint happened 8 years later, in August 1976, the JSA Axe murder incident. Right inside the Joint Security Area, that truce village we talked about earlier, a simple, routine tree trimming dispute escalated into an absolutely terrifying and deadly confrontation. North Korean soldiers actually axed 2 U.S. Army officers to death. The U.S. response to this was overwhelming and immediate. In Operation Paul Bunyan, U.S. President Gerald Ford wasn't taking any chances. He deployed nuclear-capable bombers in an absolutely massive show of military force. The tension was at an all-time high, literally teetering on the edge of all-out war, until this overwhelming display forced Pyongyang to finally back down.
And finally, let's transition to Section 4, the Iron Paradox. So we've just walked through decades of tension, assassinations, and the looming threat of nuclear bombers. But there's a grand twist here. On one hand, you have heavy fortifications and violent clashes. On the other, the most pristine ecological preserve in all of Asia. This is the great paradox of the DMZ. Because human access has been strictly and violently prohibited for over 70 years, this deadly, heavily mined human no man's land has quietly devolved into a flourishing, accidental wildlife sanctuary.
It's almost hard to believe, but endangered species are literally thriving right in the middle of a frozen war zone. The pristine buffer zone is now home to incredible animals like the extremely rare Amur leopard, the majestic red-crowned crane, and the Asiatic black bear. Without human interference, nature has completely reclaimed the space between the minefields.
The story of the DMZ offers a really powerful lesson in institutional inertia. It shows us exactly how temporary military ceasefires, agreements meant to just pause the shooting, can slowly harden into permanent, impenetrable state structures when a formal peace process fails. I mean, a line arbitrarily drawn on a National Geographic map in 1945 has become a frozen reality, trapping millions of people in a permanent state of division. Which leaves us with one final, thought-provoking question. What happens to this pristine wildlife sanctuary if true peace ever arrives and the walls finally come down? It's a fascinating dilemma. If the ultimate geopolitical goal of Korean unification is finally achieved, what are the unintended ecological consequences? When the fences fall and humanity returns to this 160-mile strip of land, will the Amur leopards and the red-crowned cranes survive the peace? Thank you so much for joining me today for this explainer, and I'll leave you to ponder that exact question.